Welcome to Wider Lens, a podcast brought to you by the Directors Guild of Canada in Ontario. And I'm your host, Annie Bradley, writer, director, and chair of DGC Ontario. On today's show, we're going to be talking about the hit Apple TV show, See. We're going to talk about world building.
Anybody new to the show would go through blind training.
Production design.
I particularly wanted to bring in the aspect of plastic, which we're littering the world with.
And locations.
We functionally built an entire town.
So the series See is about the remaining people left on this planet sometime in the future after a virus has eradicated most of the population and left the remaining population blind. It's dystopian, it's allegorical, it's a cautionary tale, it's powerful, it's a world I've never seen before. So how did they build this world? Well, you start with a production designer. And today we're going to be talking to the original production designer of season 1 and season 2, Caroline Hanania, and Dean O'Dell, who was the supervising art director on season 2, and who has now moved into the production designer position on season 3. And of course, none of this would be possible without the locations department. So we're going to be speaking with the supervising location manager, John Rakich. So Caroline, I thought I'd love to start off with just asking you, how did you come to this project in the very beginning? And sort of maybe you could just tell me the story of how it came across your desk and what drew you to it.
Well, I was originally, as you know, on season 1, and Francis Lawrence was the director of the first 3 episodes. So I met with him. And I was just really excited about doing something like this and creating a world that had never been created before and set in the future, but without necessarily a lot of the resources that we're used to. And also the fact that the characters predominantly are blind. And so actually, creating a world that they have created using materials and everything around them in the ways that they would to make their world successful. We spent months and months scouting to find really the epic locations that we were looking for to tell the story about our characters. So a lot was established really in season 1 in terms of the characters and how they lived. And then obviously the story is quite tribal, so there's different factions. And the difference between season 1 and season 2 is the fact that the characters in season 1 leave the more rural environment and come into the city. So that's what was exciting about what we found in Toronto with John's help. Amazing, really strong, powerful industrial spaces and places that just gave us an opportunity to create worlds within environments that we found, particularly, the Hearn, as you probably all know and have seen and been used in a million different ways, but we created our own world there.
I'm just going to circle back in regards to the fact that this is a world that you've created, and I love that you said the world has never been seen before. And I think that's ironic in a certain way because it is a sightless world where those with sight are the others. I just would like it to dig a little bit deeper into the design sort of philosophy of how did you approach that? I know that there was a consultant that came on board. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about the collaboration.
Absolutely. I actually wanted to bring Joe Stretchy into the conversation because he plays a huge part in terms of what we do. Joe has been blind since he was quite young, and he's an amazing collaborator. So everything that we did, we would show him and talk him through and let him play and touch all the props and talk him through the set dressing and the environments. It's all very much thought through in terms of the fact that you're working with sightless people, that we developed the language, which is knots. In some locations, we actually used guide wires that people could navigate with their canes. And then there's a lot to do with echolocation. All this is thought through and all this is discussed all the way through. Obviously, our characters don't see the environment they're in, but they have a completely different sense of it, spatial sense as well of where they are.
You just mentioned echolocation. So what does that mean? I know there's a lot of sound elements in this, but if you could just explain that.
Yes, it's to do with sound bouncing off like a tree trunk. It gives you a sense of how far away things are. Our characters have much more acute sense of hearing than we have.
So when you were looking at building and constructing these villages that happen in season 1, before we move into the urban environment, I was struck by how they were constructed. I mean, they appeared to be quite normal, from far away, but when you got in close, there was just this incredible detail in regards to the way they had used found materials to create living environments and how they had actually structured them together. And when you were doing the research for that, did you go back into, Viking, did you go back and look into that?
Well, actually, I went back, not just historically, but I actually went back into different cultures, Africa, Peru, places where people live differently, people who live on water. I wanted to broaden the environments that we have.
So you had a full crew and a full team of people in Vancouver. And in season 2, you move into the city and the show comes to Toronto. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about the challenges of, you have a team that is very adept at the whole ideology behind the series, the approach with ableism and disability and the sight issues. How do you get that team up and running when you land in a new city? What were the challenges there, or how did you approach that?
On the whole, it was pretty much a completely new team of people. I think everybody was really excited about the opportunity of creating this world. John, we had such fun scouting.
So John, that brings us to you. We've landed in Toronto, and I know that you've spoke so highly of Caroline. As you said, I didn't work for Caroline, we worked together. That was his quote as well, Caroline, which I thought was wonderful because that obviously a great collaboration. So John, why don't you tell us what were those first days like and what did you start with in this new world?
In one word, it was frantic. We hit the ground running pretty hard. But I mean, Caroline kind of brought us up to speed visually in the language and the tone of the show. But, when the decision was made to move the show to Ontario, we hit the ground running. The second you came off the plane, we were in a car going to go look at, early options for some of the key sets that kind of anchored the season. And we didn't really stop after that. We spent a lot of time driving in those first few weeks and trying to set up a production office and trying to crew up a show during what was a busy time in the city.
It was very busy.
So it was frantic would be the word. It was frantic and it was fun because we rarely get a chance to be this absolutely creative where you're building from scratch. It's not, we're looking for a doctor's office on the 19th floor. It's, we're looking up to basically build a world out of the shell of the Hearn, a power plant.
I was really struck, Caroline, by how seamlessly you switched from the rural environment into the city. And, of course, I love the Hearn. So I was like, oh, yes, this is so great. And maybe, both you and John could just sort of talk about that. Were there conversations about elements that you were looking for that existed in that rural environment that you wanted to bring in? It just seemed to effortlessly transition, and it seemed like they had just gone to the city. It seemed like the same world. Maybe you could just both talk a little bit about that.
It's true. I mean, it was Caroline brought a lot of design from as they progressed through to in the story point, stylistically things kind of slowly. It wasn't a culture shock from one world to the other. It was a slow rolling into it, which really helped.
I mean, the story changes obviously between 1 and 2 in as much as, Queen Kane escapes her original world. She goes to the silk farm, so on, she gets captured and so on and so forth. And then this time round, we actually find her in a new palace where she takes over. We built this big, pretty impressive set, I'd say, that you see throughout.
I mean, we functionally built an entire town at this location. And the irony of it is it's a very large old mental hospital outside of Toronto. The rest of the building was support space, but never seen on screen. We really kind of used the exterior of the building and built our world outside, which is very different than how most productions would have gone to use the inside space. But this is this is an outdoor world. There's no point hiding indoors. And it kind of, what helped was the core of the story rooted in a reality of that it is parts of Pennsylvania many, many years in the future. So that kind of helped guide a lot of the looks of where the story moved around from season 1 to 2, and then eventually into 3. But yeah, it was an impressive set that a lot of skilled craftsmen and craftspeople spent a lot of time putting together. And it was totally immersive.
I mean, the other location that you mentioned was the Herne. What was very appealing in that sense was the scale of this environment, the scale which gave us the opportunity to have like a broken highway running through it, and then to create our world, which we really wanted a destroyed city. So that's what we built, really, was a destroyed city within it. And then the environment where the Travantes live. We created this huge highway. Well, the highway was there, really, with the help of visual effects, but underneath it was this whole environment with markets, stalls, places where blacksmith worked, different people lived, and so on and so forth. So it was a complete contrast to where the other tribe lived. So there was this great dynamic. So that just was amazing playground.
So let's talk a little bit about, John, your job is to find the opportunity, the places where the production designer can have their vision come to life, but also about the aspects of how do we get everybody there, the engineering aspects of it when you're location scouting. Not only do you have to find the perfect location, but it also has to work for production. Maybe you could talk a little bit about those challenges.
That's the topic we don't always talk about when we're scouting with Caroline. Logistics comes after, because you don't want to stifle the creative by all of a sudden saying where the trucks are going to go. But that's the duality of what locations is. In the first half, it's creative. And then eventually there's a switch that turns over and it becomes the logistics part of where are we going to put 500 people, which is what we had when we first shot at the Herne. And luckily we were good enough in most of these places to have a large enough geographic footprint to be able to build the infrastructure we needed to support literally a small village between processing, changing, eating, feeding, bathrooms, all the unsexy things you don't see on the screen. We were just lucky that the show was always looking for the scope and scale at a location that offered that. We weren't, again, trying to squeeze into some small places with a very large production. So that has been the saving grace of the show.
One of the amazing things about this show is that it feels very lacking in visual effects. And that's a credit to both you, John, in finding amazing locations, and Caroline in building those sets that feel organic. And truly throughout it, I know there are visual effects in it, but it doesn't feel like a heavy visual effects show. The fight sequences feel very balletic and operatic and beautifully orchestrated. The camera work is very unique in its visual language because, as we know, there are no eye lines. So, it's very creative in that sense. Did you find that part of that with COVID, did you find that there was an uptick in using visual effects to help you out perhaps with the tiling of the crowd scenes and building of worlds where you couldn't go to the locations where you wanted to?
We did feel we needed to add visual effects for scale, I think, and just remnants of the world you would see. I don't know how far they took the visual effects, but we always do a lot of illustrations, and I make suggestions as to what things would look like and make sure that they try and work closely with the visual effects supervisor, in terms of what the world is, because obviously it needs to be the same world.
I wanted to ask a question about working with a large portion of the actors in the background being sight impaired. So I thought that was a wonderful aspect of the show, that they took great care to do that and to be inclusive in that regard. Maybe you could talk a little bit about this, both from, John, your perspective of finding locations that also were, suitable and safe in that regard, but also, Caroline, did you hear things that maybe, made you think about the next design you were going to do that sort of inspired you in ways that you hadn't thought of?
Well, Joe, I think, was our main go-to person, and I would, as much as possible, include him in our weekly art department meetings. And always he would go to the set dressing and props and see everything before it was on screen. And anything that he was suggesting or he didn't feel were quite right, we would always, respond to.
Joe and his entire movement team would make a point of going to go visit every place.
Yeah.
Even when we were scouting or tech surveying, to kind of get a sense of, for Joe, it was echolocation and kind of figuring out what its set was. But his movement team would go around and make sure trip hazards weren't there. The little things that we would tend to forget about for people that were blind or low vision.
And I just wanted to talk a little bit, Caroline, if you could, about how you felt confident in the continuation of this vision that you've had, this very strong and distinct vision for the show, in leaving the show in Dean's hands for season 3.
I had decided that it was time for me to move on. And I recommended that Dean took over because I felt confident that he got a really good understanding of the world that we were creating and that he would be able to carry it forth. So I'm sure he's done a great job. I trusted him. And also he managed to have the same art department, which was fantastic, which were really a lovely bunch of people who were really excited about the project. So I think it was all good. It was almost rolled from one to the other.
This show has a very big message. I mean, as you said, Caroline, this is a world that we've never seen before. I think it is a powerful message for the viewers. It's a compelling message. It's an extraordinarily original show for the fact that it's created a world, a sightless world that we are witnessing. If you could say maybe there's just one thing that you really have taken away from your time in the show, maybe you could just tell us what that might be.
Well, one thing I feel is not only the show telling the story of the characters and the evolvement within the story, but also I feel the story is set in the future. And with that in mind, I think it's also a reminder of what maybe we're doing to this planet and what's been left behind and what's going to be left behind. I mean, in our story, at least we have the advantage of people making use of some of the aspects, but it's also a reminder of where the world is going currently with this planet.
Or even the simple fact that our major plot point was a global viral outbreak that changed the world.
Yes.
And we stopped shooting because of the exact same, very similar item itself. It's a grand show that we were all lucky enough to be able to be a part of. I mean, it's a rare chance where you get to work with a bunch of collaborative people and build something from scratch. It's not a procedural drama we were shooting. It was an entire world and characters and vehicles and environs, and everything was just open to the imagination. We didn't think with limits early on. It was the limits were imposed upon us afterwards by cost and practicality. But on a creative sense, Caroline and I tried to find things that just looked cool, looked interesting.
Yeah, wonderful adventure.
Well, I would like to thank you very much for being here today and sharing your insights on this remarkable show, which I hear is the most watched show on a returning season show on Apple. So congratulations to that. And for creating this incredible world in which these characters can live. So thank you very much for joining me today. Here's to your next adventure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm here speaking with Dean O'Dell, who is now the production designer, DGC Ontario member, production designer on season 3 of C. So Caroline decides she's not going to come back in season 3. I know that she suggested that you take over the show, that they keep it in the family, that there was a trust element there. Maybe you could just talk about how that came to be.
Yeah, it really just came down to just, obviously you work close together and that there's a relationship that forms. And then that certain point that she had decided that she wanted to kind of step away. There's some stuff that she wanted to do and just take a break. And she felt kind of confident, obviously, that the team that we had established, that we were still in the groove to be able to continue on. And it's just a transition instead of kind of going from kind of a supervising art director in that capacity to more of in the creative and the conceptual sense. But we were all very kind of familiar with the story. And season 3 has kind of gone off on another little tangent. And I mean, I just love the people that are involved, and especially with Joe Strecce, and who is our blind consultant. I mean, he trained anybody new to the show would go through blind training. And we would be initiated through many different ideas of like eye covers and various other things like in a room and sound. But he really kind of taught you to design with your eyes closed, like what that world becomes, and becomes more of a sensual one through the noise, through the senses of the smell, through the touch, as opposed to just visually seeing something. And it's a world created of heroes that are low vision and heroes that are blind that would normally be done by sighted people. So it's an exciting thing to see, because we do use a lot of low vision and blind people on the show as background and extras. And it's just a cool relationship.
You came on the show on season 2, and what was it like working with Caroline? Because you brought a lot of the crew with you, right, from the boys. So Caroline said she's extremely thrilled with the crew that she got to work with. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your collaboration with her.
I mean, my job is to make sure that she can get her vision. So I'm kind of working out the mechanics of, you give me the concept, and then I break it down and budget it and give it off to the art directors and set designers, and we create the world with concept art. And at the end game, have the set that she wants, just so that you walk into that environment, tonality wise and atmosphere wise, and everything just comes together from all the different departments. So that's really my function, is to bring the team together to give that vision of the designer, to make sure that he or she gets their thought wave going out.
And obviously, these buildings and the approach to the buildings are done in a different way than traditional sort of construction, due to the fact that they are created through the sight impairment factor. And I know she talked a little bit about that. She talked about the fact that she brought a couple of the builders that they had used in season 1 to town. Did they sort of guide you guys in the way the buildings are being structured?
That's kind of the fun and beauty of this show, is like literally everything is built, from every prop to every set dressing piece to every piece of furniture to every piece of construction. And you make it real, you make it structural so that everything works for you, the paint colors work, and then you make it 500 years in the future from now. So the roles that the greens played, certainly in season 2 and in season 3, and construction, but certainly scenic department, are huge. That was really the fun of it, because the idea was that, environmentally, we wanted to try to make a statement about, things that were out there. We piecemeal recognizable pieces of furniture or vehicles or something that the audience would recognize and turn it into something totally different. But there's some genius work from some of the builders that come up with stuff, especially in the props department and set deck department. Some of the stuff they built were fantastic.
There was a discussion about everything was built from items that we as a society had left behind.
Yeah, we wanted to try to bring in like a lot of elements that were like plastics. We tried to use a lot, but anything that we tried to get a little bit of punch in color to, because we had to be careful of other things, like because of the natural degradation of wood. What would wood look like unless it was like a 12-inch timber? Really, it was kind of like an inside surgery of a lot of the buildings. And within those buildings, we tried to incorporate plastics a lot, because it just kind of said we wanted to make some type of a statement, what we're doing environmentally.
So now you're on to season 3. Our show today is about design and locations working effortlessly and supporting each other together. And this is really, I would say, probably a very unique pairing. As you said, you're not just looking for a doctor's office or something like that. You're looking for worlds, you're world building. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about the way you like to work with John Rakich.
John's awesome. Great location manager. We go back. But, it's the usual where you sit down and you break down what's on paper. You try to come up with what works. And then the guys go out and find you 3 or 4 locations, and you kind of feed through them and find out which one you feel is the best tonality that you could work with, and which one will give you the best response, and which one is most accessible for, because that's also plays really, really big in our show, just for low vision and blind, that they can access places as well as the sighted. But John's really got a good pulse on the show. I mean, his knowledge is vast, and he's got some great ideas that is always helpful. Finally,
I just thought maybe we could talk a little bit about COVID and creativity. because you, of course, took over the show right in the middle of it and rolled right into season 3 in this new position. And maybe you could just talk about what that meant for you. How did you approach it? Were there new methods that you used?
I think it changed everybody. I mean, everybody was running into the same problem where the biggest inconvenience was just supply, building, designing something, and then realizing that, you can't find a lift of plywood. So you just got really where you started to repurpose a lot of stuff going along. But I mean, everybody was pretty good about COVID. I mean, nobody wanted to be shut down. I mean, everybody wanted to complete the show and do it because it's a lot of older people on this show and younger people. So it's this fabulous mix of, us lifers, I guess, and that have got the next generation that are learning from us. But the biggest thing is it did a couple of times when we sent back, we had to kind of pull back design-wise or scale-wise just because we just couldn't get material.
Well, I think my last question to you is, this has been an extraordinary couple of years for Ontario members in regards to moving out of simple episodic television series into the much larger set piece, bigger landscape, bigger worlds, the Handmaid's Tale, the Boys, the Jack Reachers, and of course, C. I think it's really wonderful to see our members stepping into these bigger roles that in previous years always gone to Americans. And also lovely to see the Americans having the confidence and the talent here, feeling confident about stepping away and letting them take the reins. How do you feel, about what this has done for Ontario, having these big shows in, and what this has done for our art department?
It's funny because we've talked about that with a bunch of us that keep saying to the younger ones, at some point, like you guys are going to learn the rules of the road, that it's not always like this. But I mean, I sit back and, the typical, like, okay, it's pilot season. Okay, it's feature season. Okay, it's, the money's released. It's episodic television time. That whole schedule that used to happen or the movies of the week, that's like non-existent anymore. I mean, with streaming, it is full on 365 and everybody's in competition. Everybody wants to be the next C. Everybody wants to be the next Handmaids or the next Game of Thrones and it's interesting because if the networks will throw money at you, just bring it on. But that's what I was mentioning before I went to the air is that this is no longer episodic television. This is like, and again, it's the cliche of feature films like every on the hour, but some of the quality and really it's why a lot of the cast that you see are coming on board as well, because the story and scripts and some of these shows are amazing. They're so freeing. I mean, I'm not that I don't like designing a living room, but if I can build a village 500 years in the future, yeah, I would go that way. And there's so many up and coming, wonderful young women that I see that as future art directors and designers already. Like they've just got that eye and that togetherness. And it's personally, I think that's lacking. And what we really need to do is to get them up for more, because unfortunately right now, I don't think there's enough women art directors out there. So we're trying to break that bubble and bring a couple on our show. So
good to hear. Always good to hear. Well, listen, thank you so much. I'm so glad that you got to be with us, and I look forward to watching season 3. This podcast was produced by Katie Jensen and Michal Stein at Vocal Fry Studios. Our video producer is John Packman. Our executive producer is Anne Ray Stewart. And special thanks to Aviva Cohen and Laura DiGirolamo at DGC Ontario. And I'm your host, Annie Bradley. We'll see you next time on Wider Lens.